Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this professional development opportunity from the Maine Department of Education. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the state. I am very excited, and I say that a lot of times, but this is one of the times where I get to say this is one of my professional learning heroes, Dr. Chauncey Sano from the University of Michigan, one of the co-founders and authors of some of the original work from the Stanford History Education Group. She is now the co-founder and director of Read.Inquire.Write, a quality resource and program that I'm a huge fan of. And as I've noted multiple times before all this, I use with my teacher leader group, and it's a great resource. So I'm happy to have Dr. Monty Sano here along with Logan Elin. They're gonna go ahead and show you how the system works and get you introduced to their curriculum. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Chauncey.
Thanks, Joe. Welcome, everybody. Again, my name is Chauncey Montesano, and I'm a former high school history teacher and now professor at the School of Education at University of Michigan, focused on social studies education and teacher education.
And hi, everyone. My name is Logan Island, and I'm also a former high school history teacher, now a graduate student studying social studies education and teacher education with Chauncey at the University of Michigan.
So we work together as part of a team, and Mary Schleppegrell is a co-leader of our team. She's a linguist who works on creating opportunities for English learners to participate fully in complex disciplinary learning activities like we'll talk about today. And she has helped us make this material supportive of English learners. So we're really glad to be working with her. And we work as part of a larger team that includes teachers, disciplinary experts, and researchers. And together we develop curriculum and professional development opportunities for teachers who are interested in teaching inquiry with compelling questions and sources as a way to support students' disciplinary thinking and argument writing. We're grateful for support from the Library of Congress, their Teaching with Primary Sources program, and the James S. McDonald Foundation. These are organizations that enable us to do the work that we do, so we're very grateful for that. In today's webinar, we're going to share how one investigation, which is what we refer to as a lesson or series of lessons, how one investigation from Read.Inquire.Write is structured by a set of what we call disciplinary literacy tools that create a process for inquiry and for argument writing. The inquiry and argument writing process set up by Read.Inquire.Write disciplinary literacy tools is the same across all of the 15 investigations that we offer. And this is a process and a set of tools that can be used with other compelling questions and sources. And we have materials to support you in combining this process and these tools with other materials that you want to use. We found that this process and these tools in particular support teachers and students as they engage in inquiry by giving them a structure for their work and breaking down complex work into smaller bits and steps. And just to note that although we're presenting and illustrating this inquiry process online in the webinar, these curriculum materials were originally designed for classroom use where students can work together to analyze sources, but we will point out from time to time the ways that Read.Inquire work can be used in an online context, and this summer we will be developing more materials to support that work.
So a quick review of the agenda for today. Our plan is to share some background on Read.Inquire.Write. We'll consider student learning goals. We'll go over the research-based principles and assumptions that guide this work. We'll look at how the process of inquiry and argument writing is structured by a set of disciplinary literacy tools, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. Throughout the webinar, we plan to focus on one specific lesson. And like Chauncey mentioned, we call lessons here investigations. Today's focused investigation addresses water inequality in Mexico City. Throughout, we invite you to participate by sharing any comments or questions in the chat space. And our plan is to address questions and comments during the last portion of the webinar.
So first, let me share some background about the Read.Inquire.Write curriculum and an overview of its features. We developed this curriculum by working closely with middle school social studies teachers who wanted to support their students' argument writing and their social studies knowledge development. They came to us with a particular concern that the standardized test scores of their African American and Latinx students, of their students who were learning to speak English, and of their students who had fewer financial resources, they were concerned that these students' scores on standardized tests were far lower than their white, English-speaking, and more financially advantaged peers. So in developing and testing this curriculum, one thing we've done very deliberately is to attend carefully to who benefits from the curriculum, how they benefit, and why they benefit. And then we were able to make revisions to the curriculum to ensure that all the students we were working with would be able to engage with the materials and grow from their experiences with it. We partnered with teachers in designing the curriculum, observed how teachers and students worked with the curriculum, interviewed students and examined their writing over time, and talked regularly with teachers to hear their perspectives. So based on these forms of data and an analysis of those data, we iteratively developed the curriculum over a period of 4 years. As a result, we have a curriculum consisting of 5 investigations per grade level for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade that supports students' full participation in social studies inquiry, disciplinary thinking, and argument writing with sources. We share these resources freely on our Read.Inquire.Write website. For each of these investigations, the Read.Inquire.Write website offers a PowerPoint to guide instruction, a student packet of materials, and a teacher guide, as well as samples of student writing and that's been scored using our argument writing rubrics. We also have videos of students thinking about the material and videos that model for students how to analyze sources using the BOOKMARK tool to support reading. And in addition, we'll be adding English learner supports in English and in translated materials that are in Arabic and Spanish. Again, all of those materials are freely available and they're in formats that allow you to edit the materials you share with students. Argument writing can take different forms, with each form requiring more or less fluency in using claims, evidence, and reasoning to make a point. So we organized our curriculum around 3 types of argument writing to correspond with the 3 middle school grade levels. The argument types grow increasingly complex from one grade to the next. So in 6th grade, students work on what we call interpretation. This is what we refer to as a one-sided argument, where students state and support their position without acknowledging other perspectives. We'll work on an interpretation investigation today. That's the Mexico City investigation Logan mentioned. More advanced argument writing includes what we call critique and counter-argument, which are the focus of the 7th and 8th grade writing specifically. With critique, students make an argument against someone else's interpretation of a compelling question or a source set. With counter-argument, students bring their work on interpretation and critique together by making their own argument and by recognizing other perspectives on the issue while reinforcing their argument or finding a way to reconcile the different perspectives.
So now let's discuss what students learn, a brief rationale for what students learn, and what this learning might look like in students' writing. In Read.Inquire.Write classrooms, students work on key learning goals specified in the 4 dimensions of the C3 framework for social studies state standards. More specifically, students work on comprehending, analyzing, and evaluating sources or complex texts. They work on reasoning about sources and compelling questions to construct and evaluate arguments. They work on using evidence and reasoning to support claims. And they work on communicating conclusions through discussion and writing. We lay out specific learning outcomes for each investigation in the Read.Inquire.Write curriculum on the website, and how those learning outcomes roll out over time in a scope and sequence document on the website. We come at this from the perspective that students benefit from and they enjoy opportunities to dive more deeply into topics, consider complex questions and multiple perspectives, share their voices and extend their reading, critical reasoning, writing, and discussion participation skills. Inquiry lessons get students actively involved in making sense of what they read, reasoning about issues on the basis of evidence, developing and critiquing ideas, and communicating their ideas clearly, orally and in writing. In the investigation that we're looking at today, students develop evidence-based responses to this compelling question: why is access to water unequal in and around Mexico City? Students examine up to 5 sources that share perspectives ranging from indigenous women and water experts in the region to journalists to Mexico City's constitution, or Mexico's constitution.
So for their writing assignment in this investigation, students watch a news report about water scarcity and inequality in Mexico City that highlights this issue, but the report does not address why water inequality exists. So in the investigation, students pursue that question, why does it exist? And then in their writing, students write an email to the producers of that news report to share their argument about the causes of water inequality in this region, so that the news organization might consider expanding their coverage in future reports. We share Alicia's essay as one example of the kind of writing a student might produce by the end of the school year. Alicia identified as a multiracial girl. She read on grade level according to the state's standardized assessments, and she spoke English at home. The Mexico City investigation was the 4th and the final investigation of her 6th grade year, and her writing shows proficient and advanced work in aspects of social studies arguments. For example, so she includes a claim and a reason for her claim, and she includes multiple excerpts from different sources of evidence, making sure to include where this evidence comes from. She also shares some reasoning that explains how the evidence supports her claim and why the evidence she offers is credible. Earlier in the year, Alicia engaged in the first 2 investigations by analyzing sources and starting to develop ideas for arguments in the 2nd investigation. But she did not write an essay in either of those first 2 investigations. In the 3rd investigation, the one just prior to what you're looking at, she wrote her first full essay, and she followed up by demonstrating some strong growth in her argument writing that you're seeing here for the 4th and final investigation of the school year. So that's just a little about her background and trajectory. But these patterns in students' growth vary quite a lot. And so we also wanted to share Navin's essay here. Navin was an Asian American student who spoke Bengali at home. We don't have information on his reading level. He didn't choose to share that with us. We know that in investigation 1, he did not complete the writing at all. And in investigation 2, he included a claim, and he did reference sources to support his claim, but he did not offer any specific evidence or excerpt of the sources, and there was no reasoning in his essay. For Navin, the 3rd investigation, the one just prior to what we're showing here, was actually his strongest. Not only did he have the claim evidence reasoning structure, but the content of his writing and was coherent, and it showed understanding as he drew the sources together to support his claim. And he also articulated his reasoning. Here, what you're looking at is his response to the investigation 4 prompt, and he retains the claim evidence reasoning structure. He has a claim. He also selects an excerpt of a source, something really specific, a quotation, but it's not super clear how the evidence he's chosen connects to his claim. His reasoning attempts to link the evidence and the claim and assess the credibility, but he's not fully successful here in this example. So for Navin, his pattern was improvement from investigation 1 to 2 to 3, and the final investigation is a little less successful than investigation 3. So it shows to us he's still working on aspects of disciplinary thinking and writing, even though he's overall showed improvement. So we find that some students rather improve in a linear way, more like Alicia. It was more like a clean trajectory, and Navin is a different trajectory. Others improve in fits and starts, but over time, the trend we've been seeing is that students improve their argument writing and their disciplinary thinking when engaged with this curriculum. You can find, if you'd like, to look at more student work or spend more time with these students, you can find examples of students writing for each investigation on our website and the rubric we use to assess their work. So now let's shift. We want to talk about how we go about supporting students' growth in disciplinary thinking and argument writing over time. So we've just looked at 2 6th graders at the end of the year, but how did they get from where they started, which was barely writing anything at all or not writing anything at all, to writing a more complete essay? So first we'll briefly talk about the assumptions and research guiding this work. Then we'll talk about how the Read.Inquire.Write curriculum translates these ideas into practice through a set of disciplinary literacy tools that create a structure for and a process for inquiry and argument writing. We have a handout that Joe's going to send you via the chat, a link to it. If you would like to take a look at some of the things that we'll be sharing on your own time. If you're participating live, that's where you can find it. If you're watching a recording of the webinar, you can access the handout on the same page as the webinar recording was found. So several assumptions rooted in research on student learning guide our work. Those research-based assumptions include that learning is situated, that learning is social and meaning is co-constructed, that teachers are partners with valuable expertise, that students are sense makers who bring and further construct understandings of the world, and that teachers will adapt the curriculum as appropriate to their context and to their students. More specifically, the assumptions we just described support 8 guiding principles. We sometimes call them design principles or research-based principles because they're drawn from prior research in social studies education and literacy. And they indicate how we can effectively support students' growth in disciplinary thinking and argument writing in social studies. So these research-based principles inform the Read.Inquire.Write inquiry structure and the disciplinary literacy tools embedded within that structure. Each of these 8 design principles is embodied in one of our disciplinary literacy tools, or for some in multiple tools. And those are the tools that support students in doing the work involved in inquiry and argument writing.
So together, these tools create a process and a structure for accomplishing the intellectual work embedded in social studies argument writing with sources and inquiry. Each Read.Inquire.Write investigation follows this same process, and it uses each of these tools. This process and these tools could also be used with other compelling questions that aren't included on the Read.Inquire.Write website, or primary source sets that you may have access to that we did not draw on. Here, this graphic represents just one way to think about how the inquiry and writing process might unfold in the classroom. If you do use a 5-day lesson sequence, you might orient students to content on day 1, analyze and corroborate sources on days 2 and 3, prepare to write on day 4, and then write and reflect on that writing on day 5.
All right, so let's dig into each part of that process. And as we talk about the design principles and how we translate them into practice, we're going to do it in the order that Logan just presented, which is the order you might use them with students in a classroom. So we'll first look at the first 2 design principles and how they play out in an investigation. Typically, these are design principles that are central on day 1 if you use a 5-day sequence. But they're often visible throughout an investigation. Both principles relate to how teachers and students orient to content. So the first principle orients students to history and social science as evidence-based interpretation. This highlights the importance of shifting away from social studies as a class where students' main job is to sit and receive fixed information about the topics that we study. Because when information is settled or given, there's no real space for inquiry and argument. It makes it very difficult to write an argument if there's no argument to be had. There's nothing to wonder about. The questions have been answered. There's no space for different perspectives or interpretations. So if the goal is argument writing, if we present information as fixed, it's very difficult to achieve that goal. Students can see when there's no room for their ideas and for different perspectives. So instead, we have to work hard to shift social studies class to become a space where we ask complex questions that have multiple plausible responses and that require us to consider different sources of evidence and different perspectives to develop responses. In a context like this, there is space for genuine inquiry, and students become partners in constructing new knowledge as they actively work to respond to questions on the basis of the sources they read that can be conflicting. And when they're engaged in this way, the content can also be more meaningful for them and therefore easier to remember, and they can develop other skills like how do we evaluate what we read.
So on this slide, you can see one example of this first principle in practice. Here we see the central question: why is access to water unequal in and around Mexico City? And it's an open-ended question with multiple plausible responses. We see here below the question the multiple sources that students will work with that represent different perspectives on the central question. So this is one example of how a good, compelling question and a set of sources that present diverse perspectives on that question can set up an inquiry that frames social studies as interpretation instead of fixed information. Here we have a video, and in this video, you'll see how a teacher communicates this concept to his students at the beginning of not the Mexico City investigation, but an investigation on child labor in Nepal. So I'll play that now.
Here's where we are. This is our question that we're going to investigate. And we're going to have a really great opportunity to examine first-person accounts. We saw that video yesterday. We're going to be reading statements from kids like that who are doing that work in the brick kilns in Nepal. We're going to get statements from different people involved in the whole situation. And they're going to talk about why they're doing it, if they like doing it, don't like doing it, what's good about it, what's hard about it, the whole situation. As we read each of these documents, our focus is on why does it exist? It does exist. We're not asking is it good or bad. Why is it there? Why is this thing prevalent in Nepal where it's maybe existed in this country, but we don't, it's not everywhere? DJ.
I think that most people probably already know the answer to this after everyone gave their statements in the video talking about why they have to do.
I think it's cool that everybody has a hypothesis. Everyone has a feeling right now. We're going to look at, I think, 9 different documents. And some of them you're going to go, whoa, I never thought of it. So some of us, I'm sure, will change our hypothesis. Some of us might change it and come back, and some might stay with it. But I ask you to have an open mind and look at these documents and these things as new information that you need to think about and evaluate. Okay.
So the idea of keeping an open mind and considering the sources as students develop their interpretations in response to a compelling question is just one important message for students that helps create a space for inquiry.
So the second principle is making connections with students' incoming knowledge and extending it. This principle recognizes the need to identify and build on the relationship between ideas and content in an investigation with students' background knowledge, their interests, and their life experiences. This principle rests on the assumption that students will actively construct new ideas about the world around them as they grapple with the past that they're learning about in their history class. As such, the social studies should be supportive of and responsive to students' unique identities and the ideas that they are going to inevitably bring to class. So similar to the first principle, this is one that shows up throughout an investigation, but we see often on day one a space for making these connections.
In this slide, you can see a simple, perhaps surface level approach to connecting to students' lives to the Mexico City investigation. We have 2 questions here. The first, what does the word unequal or inequality mean to you? And the second, where have you seen or experienced inequality in your life? Notice that the space for a connection in this example is not the specific topic of Mexico City or even water inequality, but instead the concept of inequality, which is both central to the investigation and a concept that everyone has some kind of relationship with. In this slide, you can see another approach to extending students' incoming knowledge and experience by illustrating and explaining a core concept with specific information from the region being studied. Here we have some information that points out how access to water in and around Mexico City is unequal. We tell students some people use 600 liters per person each day and have expensive home water, while others are not allowed to use more than 20 liters per day. They have water delivered to them each week. So these are just some brief examples of the meaning of our first two design principles and how those principles might play out within a Read.Inquire.Write investigation.
So design principles 3 and 5 will focus on next, and these highlight the importance of supporting reading and language development. Because social studies inquiry and argument writing is grounded in using sources, students typically benefit from support in reading and in making sense of the sources they're reading, as well as in learning to critique and evaluate what they read. Students need support with both the comprehension and the analysis, in other words. So support for reading and analysis is mainly achieved through a combination of explicit instruction with regular talk in pairs and small groups and whole class discussion, because students benefit from both modeling and the consistent opportunities to talk about and process what they read through their own discourse. In addition, Read.Inquire.Write offers support for understanding the language found in disciplinary texts, for noticing and mimicking language in academic writing, and for using students' incoming language resources as a starting point for learning new content and disciplinary practices. Every disciplinary literacy tool is designed to support students' English development through attention to language. Read.Inquire.Write also realizes these principles through modifying complex texts so that they're appropriate for middle school students. We do this by taking shorter excerpts and adapting some original language while retaining the meaning to the best of our ability. This is why every source includes a note that says it's adapted from the original. And we also, in addition, have many sources in each investigation, and we recommend that teachers review them and make selections among the sources that we offer, particularly as they are beginning this work. So one way we translate these principles into practice is through the BOOKMARK tool to support students' comprehension and analysis of individual sources one at a time. The BOOKMARK supports students in annotating sources with attention to the language in the source and information about the source that prepare them to evaluate it. The BOOKMARK is best used with some explicit instruction where teachers might model analysis of a source in addition to the regular opportunities for talk and discussion in pairs. That's why the BOOKMARK tool we will share includes regular reminders in the tool itself, to pause and prompt students to work in pairs and talk together about their reading. So what you're seeing now is a graphic designed to help you sort of see the different parts of it. But the BOOKMARK is meant to be a larger version of an actual bookmark with parts 1 and 2 on the front and part 3 on the back. So if you print it out as one page like I have here, you could fold it in half, and ultimately it looks like this. So here's part 1 and 2 on one side, and you flip it over and have part 3 on the other side. If you're making a big class set, you can copy it back to back and then chop it in half and save some paper that way. And we've worked with teachers a lot who create a class set and laminate it as a way to manage the resources. On the website itself, there are videos of us demonstrating and explaining how we might use the BOOKMARK to help us make sense of and analyze one source for each investigation that we offer. So here's an example of one student's annotations of a source from the Mexico City investigation after using the BOOKMARK. And you can see a range of notes here, from defining key terms to reacting to and evaluating the source.
Part 1 of the bookmark prompts students to work in pairs to read bibliographic and contextual information about each source. As students read, Part 1 supports students to work together to understand where the source comes from and what may have influenced its creation so that they'll be able to understand it more fully. This work can be done in partners, small groups, or during whole class discussion, but we discourage having students work individually unless it's absolutely necessary, because talking through these ideas is so important and supports students' understanding and language development. Using part 1 of the bookmark, you can see here that the student analyzed the attribution at the bottom, and they noticed the author, they noticed when the source was published, and they noticed what we know about the author. The student also analyzed the headnote at the top of the source, and they noticed what kind of work the author does, how he came to learn the information he shares here in the source. The key here is to notice details that help you understand where the source comes from and why it was created in the first place. In part 1 of the bookmark, students simply notice this kind of information so that they can begin to analyze the source and prepare to evaluate it, as they're prompted to do in part 3 of the bookmark.
And you can see in each of these, the darker gray is the space where we prompt students to have conversations. And like Logan was saying, it's ideal if students can have those conversations, because that really does support their reading so much. Obviously, in the current online virtual learning context, that classroom-based talk is not possible in the same ways that it was, but we have seen teachers ask students to buddy up and call each other and talk through what they're reading, or talk with family at home if they have family available at home. So I'll talk about part 2 of the bookmark now. In this part, this is where Mary Schleppergrell's expertise really shines through in this particular tool. This part of the bookmark supports students to read the source very closely, ideally with a partner, and to talk about what it means and how it offers evidence toward the investigation's central question. The bookmark part 2 lists 4 questions. You can see questions A, B, C, and D there. These questions can be used to guide interactive reading of a source. We recommend using just 1 question per source and suggest which question is most useful for each source in the upper right corner of the student's packet and the PowerPoint where that source is presented. We offer different questions here, A through D, for reading these sources, because the sources students read in social studies inquiries vary quite a lot and have different language demands. So some might be narratives about what people do, others are laws or other kinds of official documents, others may be news sources that have opinions or arguments in them, and some might have no text at all. Students might need to read a map or a chart or a photograph. The 4 questions in part 2 are designed to help students work with the different ways that language is presented and information is organized in these different kinds of sources. Students work in pairs to read and discuss each sentence in the source. As they interact, they talk both about the language choices the author made and about the meaning of that language in relation to the bookmark question they're exploring. This gives every student the opportunity to understand the evidence that each source offers as they consider the central question of the investigation. Using part 2 of the bookmark with this source, we move to make sense of the source. We'll focus here on prompt C in part 2, which says, find sentences that begin with transition words or introductory phrases. What key ideas come after transition words or introductory phrases? So looking at a slide of the actual source that's in the PowerPoint, we see in the upper right-hand corner that prompt that I mentioned about using the transition words question for this particular source. The prompt guides students to find the transition words and phrases and then underline what comes after. So what we've done here to help is to identify examples of transition words or introductory phrases in red, and then underline what comes after that. Because what comes after the transition words or phrases is almost always a key idea in the text. We have supporting materials for teachers and students to learn how to do this, since it's new to many of us, at least it was to me. Once students learn to find the transition words and phrases, they can focus on what comes after. Again, typically a key idea in the text, and they can put all their energy into figuring out that part of the sentence that comes after a transition word or phrase. They don't need to find every single transition word or phrase either. They can focus on one or a few, and then they can really focus in on what comes after those phrases and begin to unlock the meaning of the text.
So here we see part 3 of the bookmark, and part 3 of the bookmark helps students step back after they've read a source and think critically about it. Part 3 of the bookmark includes prompts and questions that guide students to evaluate the source and draw conclusions about how it might begin to help them answer the central question of the investigation. Once students have gained some understanding of the source and where it comes from, the bookmark part 3 prompts them to step back and start to reason about the source by evaluating it in light of the compelling question. Part 3 prompts students to consider what questions they have about the source, assess the reliability or the relevance and the credibility of the source given the compelling question, and to consider how the source helps them think about the compelling question. Part 3 of the bookmark prompts students to have small group discussions about these questions, to make annotations on the source, and to identify a segment of the source that's useful in responding to the central question so that students can draw on this thinking when they prepare to write. Here is a video that's an abbreviated example of how a class uses both part 1 and part 3 of the bookmark with the same Jonathan Watts source that Chauncey just talked through on the previous slide from the Mexico City investigation. Students first notice details about the source, where it came from using part 1, and then they begin to evaluate the source's credibility using part 3 of the bookmark. We've skipped their work with part 2 for this segment.
So 6th graders, we've done this. We become experts in this process. Someone explain to me.
Attribution, and we look for who wrote it and what day or what time of the year.
Okay, Amanda, go ahead and read that. We'll do the attribution and hand it quickly together, and then I'll have you read the source more to James. Amanda, attribution. Actually, on your own. Read the head note and circle information about who Jonathan Watts is and what he writes about. On your own, so that should be level 0. Reading the head note, circling information about Jonathan Watts and what his article is about. Put a hand up if you can say something about the author of this article, about what his job is, what his background is. Grace, talk to us. Do we trust Jonathan Watts?
Yeah.
Someone who said yes, put your hand up and explain why. What makes him a reliable person? Toby, what do you think?
Because he got the perspectives of many different people.
Excellent. So is he just listening to rich people when he wrote this article? No, he talked to experts and also considered many perspectives. Excellent. Anything else that makes Jonathan Watts a reliable person to learn from or to listen to? Let's see, Zainab. Okay, so the author, he went to where? Okay, actually went to Mexico. I don't have any more room, but was anyone thinking because he has a lot of experience traveling around the world? Okay. What makes him maybe unreliable? He's not lying to us, right? He's not trying to deceive us, but anything that makes us think maybe he's not as helpful as other sources, or who have you not heard from? Shannon, do you have an unreliable? Not sure. Toby, what do you think?
He is not from Mexico, so he might not understand Mexican, like Spanish, I mean.
Oh, good. What do we call someone who's not from a place who writes about it or studies it? We left this in our last investigation. Starts with the O.
Outsider.
Yeah, outsider. He's an outsider, right? And again, it doesn't say if he speaks Spanish. He probably if he doesn't speak Spanish, have like a translator who work with him or an interpreter. Do you have anything else? Okay. So he might have some limitations from his organization.
So one idea that we'd like to reinforce here is the combination of explicit instruction, individual work, pair and small group conversations, and whole class conversation.
Great. So now we're going to turn to the fourth design principle, working our way through an investigation. Students have learned about some background, some content, started to make connections. They've read a bunch of individual sources. Now we turn to the fourth principle, which is facilitate and foster discussion of sources and the compelling question to construct arguments. So discussion has actually been happening quite a bit throughout, but here we want to be pretty deliberate about supporting students in beginning to develop arguments. If you ever get stuck and find that students are having a hard time figuring out what to write, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to put down, this principle is key in helping them move past that. With the bookmark tool, students spend time thinking about each individual source, but they also need time in addition to help them think across all of the sources, to corroborate them and make connections between sources, and also to identify evidence they think is important given the compelling question. So this principle focuses on that work and highlights the important role of discussion in supporting that work. Students learn through talking about the content and processing ideas collaboratively. So just as we promote student talk while reading sources, we promote talk while corroborating sources and weighing evidence, so that students are actively involved in evaluating sources and identifying plausible claims. This principle is translated into practice through the way the evidence tool that Logan is sharing here now. This tool has 3 parts. Step 1 is sorting the sources, 2 is discussing possible arguments, and 3 is tracking ideas in an anchor chart. And discussion happens throughout all of these steps. So in the first part of Weigh the Evidence, students sort sources using cutouts of miniature sources that we provide, or they can do it through digital manipulation. So imagine 3 or 4 students huddled around a table talking through which sources agree on the same point and manipulating the miniature sources to play around with different ideas. That's what's supposed to be happening here, playing around. So we give different prompts like here, which sources agree, and students can move them around, or here, which sources are more useful for helping us with the central question. These are the kinds of prompts we can offer. And students can come up with their own prompts. You can come up with your own prompts, whatever seems helpful. But through this process, students are actively involved in processing, playing with ideas, talking together. This is what happens in the sorting step of Weigh the Evidence.
And here, the second part of the Weigh the Evidence tool involves whole class discussion of what the sorts that Chauncey just mentioned allowed students to think about or see, and what claims they're beginning to see as supported by the sources that they have. We try to encourage students to speak to and to challenge each other's ideas, to encourage listening and speaking in class, and to encourage to continue thinking analytically about what warrants a good claim. Next, the discussions proceed to considering good evidence and reasoning and linking these components of argument together, the evidence and the reasoning. The final part of the Weigh the Evidence tool on this slide involves capturing ideas from this whole class discussion. This can happen either simultaneously with the discussion or after the whole class discussion. It can involve the teacher as scribe, or a student can write. The main goal is to have one anchor chart, though, that captures the different ideas the class has generated about plausible claims in response to the compelling question, as well as evidence and reasoning. We discourage having every student write down the ideas in their own individual anchor chart because they'll run out of steam for the writing, and because the anchor chart is really meant as a record of collective thinking. Having an anchor chart that captures the ideas in progress and that is visible for everyone to see especially supports English learners and students who need more support with reading and writing.
So we'll show just a brief part of a video here where a teacher is wrapping up a discussion in which he and a few students worked together with the whole class sort of watching and sometimes participating. They were working together to identify a claim and evidence and reasoning to support the claim using the Weigh the Evidence anchor chart posted on the board. And this came after sequences of developing ideas and talking in small groups. This is a 6th grade class that's working on the same Mexico City investigation that we've been talking about.
This is the
So we're just going to skip right to the very end, we think maybe, where he wraps it up because of time. But here he's kind of pulling it all together.
Who specializes in sustainability of water resources.
All that. So that definitely makes them reliable. You see what Amara did with Emily and Jamar's support. She made a claim. She told us what source supports it. She gave us a piece of evidence from that source. She explained it, and she told us why we should trust it. Philip, claim, evidence, reasoning. You have a few minutes to choose another one of these, your choice. Put it here. So don't start yet because I'm going to give you a tip. Give me a source, give me a quote, explain it.
So in that example, the class had just worked together and the teacher there just summarized how you might put together a claim, evidence, reasoning structure with just one idea that some students pulled together collectively in a conversation. And now he's prompting them to come up with other ideas. There are other claims that are possible. So what are other arguments we could develop? And they work individually and in groups and then have further conversation. So this is just one example, both of how the Weigh the Evidence process and tool might wrap up, but also building a model of argumentation that everybody can see. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So we're going to talk about design principle 6, which is teaching with models of social studies argument writing and making expectations for such writing explicit. It's easy to assume students know what we're talking about when we ask them to write arguments, but it's not always the case. So much of what we ask students to read and write in social studies doesn't model argumentation. It typically, much of what we have, what students have to read in social studies shares information as though it's absolutely certain. And given that norm, if that's a norm in your classroom or in the classrooms that students you work with have been in, then we need to be really explicit and show students what argument looks like in social studies because it's a real shift sometimes. So teaching with models includes showing students what argumentation in social studies looks like, that people can disagree and have different arguments, that arguments are grounded in evidence, that arguments tend to have a claim, evidence, reasoning structure of some sort. Teaching with models also includes unpacking those models and making the thinking that goes into developing the arguments visible. The video we just watched of the teacher wrapping up a student construction of an argument was about developing a claim supported by evidence and reasoning. That's one example of a model. Read.Inquire.Write offers 2 tools as additional examples of models to support argument writing and inquiry. One is we refer to as the mentor text, and the other we refer to as useful language. So in each investigation, this is one example of a mentor text from Mexico City. The mentor text presents students with an example argument on a different topic that offers students a way to see what their writing could look like so that foundational components of argument writing are clear and attainable. Each mentor text includes a hopefully clear use of the claim, evidence, reasoning model and resembles the argument type and assignment of the investigation in which it's included. Here again, this is the Mexico City investigation, and Logan will take us through how we might work with it in a classroom.
In this PowerPoint slide and in similar slides within each investigation on the Read.Inquire.Write website, we highlight the claim in a mentor text in red, and we include questions that help students and the class unpack the claim, and those questions are here at the bottom. We do something similar with evidence. We highlight the evidence in purple in the mentor text, and we include, again, questions here at the bottom that help the class talk about the evidence explicitly. Similarly, we highlight the reasoning green in mentor text across each investigation, and we include questions that prompt students to think about the reasoning and the reasoning within the mentor text. So in this short video, the teacher here uses the mentor text to facilitate a discussion that unpacks students' thinking about the features of claims and evidence. And I will begin that.
Following states in the Midwest region: Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota. Does that seem like a piece of evidence? Yeah? No? Yeah, Mina, you say yeah? How did you know that this was a piece of evidence? The quotation mark? What else does it say that helps us know that it is evidence? What other language is used here that helps us know it's evidence? Sebastian?
It says the geography division of the U.S.
Census Bureau?
Yeah, it lists it all, and then,
It gives the list.
yeah, and then from it right in the quotation.
Okay, so it's telling us where that quote came from. Anyone notice anything else in this sentence that might help you know that it is a fact that helps support the answer? Yeah?
It says, it does this,
It does that. What else? What other language does it use? What other words does this sentence have that helps you know it's about to give you a fact?
For example.
Oh, so it says, for example.
Were we to keep watching this video, we would see the teacher and students unpack the concept and language of reasoning using the mentor text. And this is the kind of classroom work that supports students' transition to the writing process.
One other tool that supports students with models of how to do the work of writing is the useful language tool. This provides students with sentence stems that further support the transition from thinking to writing. Using sentence stems is a common way of supporting students, especially English learners, in getting started. Sometimes sentence stems are used to provide a template that students just fill in. And we take a different approach that we think is important for students' language development. That is, we want to offer students choices, reinforcing that writing calls for presenting their individual perspectives. We model the ways the different moves can be presented by offering the same meaning through different language choices. The choices that we offer reflect different degrees of sophistication in making the disciplinary moves. Here, for example, in making a claim, starting with "you should not" is a very direct way that can be understood by even beginning English learners. The more sophisticated, "the exhibit should not include" or "I recommend" offers choices to students who want to see more advanced ways of offering a claim. Modeling different possible meanings gives students autonomy. Our research on the choices students make as they use the useful language tool to write shows that they make different choices for expressing their claim, for expressing and sharing their evidence, for sharing their reasoning, and that they insert their own meanings into the choices that they make, even when they use examples that we provide. So our design principle 7 now focuses on supporting a writing process that focuses on meaning, not on form, and includes planning, composing, feedback, reflection, and revision. Everything we've talked about so far is about a writing process, but we'll highlight here 2 tools. Because writing is hard work, it doesn't just magically happen, and it takes preparation and focus on the ideas that students are writing, not just the grammar or the spelling. Research has been very clear that focusing on students' ideas is the best path to improving their writing, and that focusing on things like spelling or grammar constrains their progress, and that those skills are easier to develop and will come along with practice anyway. So today we'll emphasize 2 parts of the process: planning to write, supported by the Planning Graphic Organizer tool, and reflection on writing and setting goals for improvement, supported by the reflection tool.
The planning graphic organizer that Chauncey just mentioned is where students begin to make their own choices about what to write. It's important to pause and give students a chance to make an active decision about what argument they think is the strongest and why they think it's the strongest, and also to make active choices about what to include in their essay. This isn't a place for students to write out everything, but instead just to make brief notes as they make decisions. Students would typically have the planning graphic organizer on their desks next to the sources with their annotations, and they'd be able to look at the class's anchor chart posted in the class somewhere. The planning graphic organizer is different from the anchor chart produced through the Weigh the Evidence tool. While the Weigh the Evidence is communal thinking about possibilities and the anchor chart tracks all that thinking, the planning graphic organizer is the individual students' choices and their own game plan for writing.
So the reflection tool is this is sort of the last step of the process of writing. This tool prompts students to pause in their writing. It reminds them of the goals for their writing and to make active choices for their next steps with their writing. Whether they make those next steps in revising what they have or completing their initial draft in progress. In other words, students can use the reflection tool to self-assess and to set goals for improvement. This tool also offers the opportunity to reflect on examples of student writing collectively as a class and to offer collective feedback. This can work really well when teachers monitor students' writing and identify common successes and challenges students have. Teachers can ask particular students to share their writing in advance with an eye to inviting students whose writing highlights some common issues that might be beneficial for the whole class to talk through. After reading a projected sample of a student's writing, the teacher can facilitate a discussion of where the writer has realized the goals of the assignment and where there's room for improvement. The teacher or other students can offer feedback by identifying how the student might improve and what goals the writer might have as their next steps. If the sample of writing represents common issues, then this becomes whole class feedback. The reflection tool can be used to guide such a discussion. Alternately, another way teachers have used this is to have students use the reflection tool to offer peer feedback. Finally, we've seen this as a way to pause students partway through their writing before they've even finished a draft, just to reset and remind them of where they're heading. So there are different ways to work with this tool, and the ultimate goal is to remind students of the expectations for writing and help them set their goals as they move forward at whatever phase they are in the writing. So the final design principle, the final research-based design principle we'll share is about designing assessments with sources that requires argument, offers an authentic purpose or audience, and connects past to present. This principle is partly drawn from our research with historians about their writing processes and what the kinds of things that they write, and also from literacy research. We so often ask students to write 5-paragraph essays for us as teachers as their main audience, but that's not a very common form of writing outside of school. So based on some of the research we did with historians, we tried to expand our conception of writing tasks so that they become forms of expressing one's view for a real world purpose and in a form of writing that people can actually use outside of school. We also aim to have students write to as close to an authentic audience as possible. We've developed these guidelines for assignments that you see here, which reflect the real world writing of historians, because having this kind of setup has also shown to support students' writing development. And this sample assignment from the Mexico City investigation, I'll just highlight that this is an assignment designed to not have a right or wrong answer, but instead to have students make their own interpretations, make their own argument, draw on evidence from the different sources that they've read, and hopefully it's something that is interesting because they've watched a news report and they're reacting to it. Part of designing assignments that motivate students is tying larger themes and issues to local ones, as well as connecting the past to the present, both of which help students further consider the world around them and their place in it.
So like we mentioned at the beginning, Read.Inquire.Write breaks argument writing down into 3 different types: interpretation, critique, and counter-argument. in order to create a progression of increasingly complex writing that builds students' disciplinary literacy skills over time. We developed these investigations to create a progression from interpreting sources to critiquing the arguments of others, and finally to developing counter-arguments that rebut others' claims. The interpretation investigations were originally developed to be used by 6th grade students, and they ask questions like the one we've been focused on here. Why does water inequality exist in and around Mexico City? 7th graders write critiques in ancient world history investigations where they're asked to do things like critique a museum curator's representation of the ancient Silk Road in their exhibit on that topic. In 8th grade, students engage in counter-argument investigations by making their own arguments about, for example, the approaches of abolitionists as they tried to end slavery. And as they do so, they recognize, reconcile, or rebut possible counter-arguments. We put this sequence together as a progression in increasingly complex form of argument, but you can adjust them for any of these grade levels and the writing focus that you want to support with your students. Each type of argument writing calls for students to write claims that are supported by evidence and reasoning. The disciplinary literacy tools support the development of claims, evidence, and reasoning across all the investigations and all the argument types, with slight variation according to type of writing.
So those are all the pieces. Now coming back to the big picture, this is how all these design principles come together in a process to support inquiry and argument writing, and how they're aligned with the different disciplinary literacy tools that create that structure for the classroom work to support students as they engage in inquiry and argument writing. So each of the 8 design principles is aligned with at least one of the steps in this process that is set up by the disciplinary literacy tools. And we also offer this version of a 5-day layout. It's just one example of how you might stretch that process out in a somewhat realistic way within a classroom space. We've heard from teachers who want to spend less time than this and who want to spend much more time than this. And that's why we encourage people to adapt the material. But this is an example of a 5-day structure where day 1, you orient to content. Day 2, analyze and evaluate sources. Day 3, continue analyzing and evaluate sources, moving from individual sources to looking across all of them. Day 4, developing your arguments, where you are making plans, looking at mentor texts. And day 5, communicating those arguments, where you might be actually composing with the useful language tool at your side and reflecting. So this is how the Read, Inquire, Write puts together these different steps in a process of inquiry and argument writing in a way that we hope is structured, and we've seen with students in middle school and teachers in middle school that we've seen them find that it's working. It's helping students make gains towards these goals that they've laid out. So we want to thank you for listening and for considering Read, Inquire, Write as a set of tools to support your work with students. We look forward to your questions and comments via chat, or unmute your microphones and share what's on your mind. Sorry, we went a bit over there.
That's why I told you ahead of time. I didn't want you to have to rush.
You called it, Joe.
There were not any questions in the chat.
Yeah, I didn't see any.
During the session. Does anybody have any questions at this time for Chauncey or Logan? Kate says, I wish that every student I have was getting this program before they got to me. Kate's a former middle school teacher who's now a high school teacher.
Oh, nice. Yeah, well, it's really, we've had that happen where the high school teachers who have worked with the middle school teachers we worked with as we were developing the curriculum, they were pretty happy. They noticed. So that's exciting.
I will ask a question.
Yeah.
I can just tell you how I've kind of modified it again. The exposure that the teacher leader cohort got on this was very brief, and it was really focused on the bookmark as a disciplinary.
Right.
How would you look at, so the investigations are grades 6, 7, and 8 are kind of set up that way. And clearly, right, we have high school students who, depending on their levels and stuff, what would you say for an elementary teacher, an upper elementary, what parts of this would you take away as useful in their classroom, or have you done any work with that?
Yeah, for upper L, I would say the idea of a process and structure for a process certainly still applies. In terms of orienting to content, one thing that I've been doing in the elementary teacher ed course that I teach is to bring in more children's literature as a way to develop and extend students' incoming knowledge, to use story essentially as a way to build that background. And because that background not only helps everybody get engaged and oriented, but also gives more support for reading. And then I think that there's still an important role for more typical historical sources. And my approach would be to excerpt those sources further. For any source that's here, I would take a few sentences. There are a lot of key ideas you can get out of very little text. Another way is to use more visual sources, but I wouldn't want to not use textual sources just because it helps build students' capacity so well. The active work of kind of sorting sources is still really useful. I think in upper L, it's very concrete and tactile. I think in examining a mentor text, I would actually do a similar thing where I would have students cut up a mentor text and have them sort the parts of a text. Again, there I would probably simplify the text and the lexile level of the text in particular. I might look at more examples of writing and I with elementary students, and I might also co-write with elementary students. So in a group, what might be a claim you want to make, and together as a group figure out how you might want to say that, and then have groups nominate sentences and get one sentence up, and then do the same thing with what would be a piece of evidence we could use. So have more of a co-writing model initially at least, and a simpler claim evidence reasoning structure where it's maybe just a sentence for each and that's it. But a lot of the intellectual work, I think upper L students can do, and it's partly a matter of how much time. It may take longer. And one way that I've seen social studies, that I've seen upper L teachers do this, is to integrate the social studies and literacy block time, to not just save this work for the social studies time, because you're really killing two sets of standards with one effort in integrating this and bringing this kind of work in. So it's not, doesn't just have to be social studies time in upper L. In terms of adapting for high school, I think it's a little easier. In the work that I've done, I started both as a high school teacher and doing research in high school, and the same process applies. I think one thing that can happen in high school is students who often benefit from support in reading and writing can realize that can have at high school level figured out a way to get by without developing those skills because they may need more support. And so this process helps with developing those skills that some students may find they need further support with. The process is the same. I think it's more taking the process and applying it to different topics. It could be in high school, depending on what your building is doing and what your students have experience with. It could be that you just focus on counter-argument types of writing and skip the interpretation and critique. Those are meant as building blocks to work toward counter-argument. I would only do that if your students in high school have had experience writing arguments before, but that may be a way to adapt as well. And then, is there a model that high school teachers can use to create their own investigation? Yes, I mean, we consider this set of disciplinary literacy tools as a model, and then we also are in the process of creating kind of a step-by-step process for how would you use these disciplinary literacy tools with other content, and where you might find pre-existing sets of primary sources. Either many of them already have a compelling question as a central focus, Sometimes that would be up to you to develop that compelling question, and then how you would put them together. Part of what we're doing this summer is relaunching our site, and we will include that kind of step-by-step process for how to take these ideas in this process that structures inquiry and argument writing and put it with different content, if so in high school or upper L, if you want to look at different content than these middle school topics. In terms of special education adaptations, the supports that we have for reading and writing, we have found have been helpful for students with special needs, and just through supporting the reading and writing work, that skills development. So to the extent that those are the needs that need to be met, we think that this is supportive of students. We've looked at students who read 2 or more years below grade level, and they need various supports, and seen them grow. But that's also, answering that question is also contingent on what the needs are that you're trying to meet. So if it's about reading and writing and literacy related skills development, then yes, those are embedded.
Thank you those for dropping those into the chat box. Other questions? I guess I'm realizing I never turned on the function for them to unmute themselves.
Oh.
Let's switch that on in case you want to.
Yeah.
But I see Chauncey that you're
Yeah.
reading, so I'll let you.
Yeah, the materials are free. It's all freely available. We want to support you in supporting students in these ways. So I've tried different versions, and I think this is the way to go because there's a lot you can put on the website. And the materials are also in their student packets, teacher guides, PowerPoints, and the other files I first mentioned are in Word documents, so you can adapt them. In terms of adapting the sources, the question is about adapting the sources to make them more approachable and understandable for students. What we tend to do is look at the sources, look at the compelling question, have a lot of back and forth between those, and think about what aspects of the sources would most help a student respond to this question, or what aspects of a source might a student draw on in order to respond to the question. And from there, we go to excerpt the source, those parts of the source. We almost always end up with more than is manageable in a classroom, we're assuming teachers have constraints in the amount of time they can spend. So from there, we try to excerpt further. And then we look at the lexile, we consider the reading difficulty of what remains. And if we find that there's a lot of phrases or words that sentence after sentence seem like they'll be super challenging, then we will make changes. And sometimes we put those in brackets, and sometimes we don't if we feel like there's so many brackets that it's going to be distracting to the reader. So that's why in the teacher guides, we have the original sources or links to the original sources. And in the sources themselves that the students have, we have a phrase that says adapted. We've tried different things. I think the best thing to do for students' growth is to actually align the reading level. We're just using Lexile. It's just one indicator. It's not perfect. Align the reading level with students' grade level, knowing that there will be students reading below grade level, and then work on supporting the reading through interaction and through the use of the tools so that students can move ahead. If the reading level is so far below, that gap may be just too big. And so then you'd want to shorten further and adjust language further so that students can get into it. But we also support students reading by offering some slides that give background and clarify specific references and words in the source that's right next to when the students are reading the source. So not like a day before, but as students are reading, bring in those kinds of supports. I don't know if that answered the question, Andrew, if you have others.
And now you have the ability to unmute yourself since I changed that setting. So if there's any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put in to the chat box. I don't want to keep everybody here if there aren't any questions, but I want to give you the opportunity to ask.
Great.
Last call on any questions.
I'll just say while we're waiting, one brief note is that this summer we have already developed some read alouds of sources, recordings of us reading the sources aloud in case the online learning circumstances continue. It's not ideal. I think it takes away some of the advantages of pushing the talking about the source, but we also recognize in the online setting you are constrained in many incredible ways. So thank you for all you've been doing for students. But we will also be creating Google Docs of the different student packets, so you can have interaction through comments with students back and forth, and different kinds of slides that you could put in Google Classroom if you use that or something like it, that students can share their responses to some of the work. Then we're thinking about other things as well, but those will be available probably by end of July.
Awesome. I do not see any other questions jumping in there, so I will give you our formal thank you, Chauncey and Logan, for spending an hour of your time with us today.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for all you're doing to support students. It's amazing. It's not been an easy time, I know, but thank you.